Okie dokie. Well, while people are trickling in, I will get started. Um, hello everyone, and welcome to this evening's Zoom webinar that's being produced by the Honors College at West Virginia University. This event is the fifth Honoring Diversity lecture taking place this spring 2024 semester. I am Savannah Mead, the graduate assistant in the WVU Honors College, and tonight's session is entitled Leadership and Power, Using Privilege to Impact Diversity and Inclusion. The session will be moderated by Dr. Matt Martin and will include Dr. Kevin Gooding and Dr. Peter McGay. We will follow our standard Zoom webinar format this evening, so after the presentation, we will be hosting an open question and answer session. Since we're using the Zoom webinar platform for the lecture, before we begin, I'm going to review some of the features that'll help you experience this evening's lecture in the best way possible. If you have any issues with audio or video at any point during the webinar, please check your personal Zoom settings and your computer's volume controls. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Due to enhanced security protocols, webinar attendees will not be able to see any other questions, just their own. We will go through this at the end, though. To ask a question, you will click on the Q&A button, a separate screen will appear, and then you can type your question. The presenter will either answer all of your questions live at the presentation, or if it's able to be answered with a typed response, you'll get a typed response. If live captioning has been requested, it can be viewed by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If live captioning was not requested, a captioned version of this recording will be available at honors.wvu.edu. So with all of that being said, let's get started with this evening. And I will stop my screen share and you guys can take it away.
All right, well, thank you. Good evening. My name is Matt Martin, for those of you that don't know me, and I guess my name is right there. There does seem to be like an error in the information sheet because it says experts, and I wouldn't necessarily consider myself an expert, but I'd like to start off tonight by at least introducing myself before letting Kevin introduce himself as well. I've been at WVU since 1994. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication Studies. We are currently located in Armstrong Hall. I was chair of the department from 2001 until 2019. So for 18 years, I've served on numerous committees and such in the college and for the university. Been exposed to different ways that the university operates. My areas of interest as far as teaching and research tend to be in interpersonal and instructional communication, also some film appreciation, some media, and recently some diversity courses as well. So, Kevin.
All right, thank you, Matt. I'm Dr. Kevin Gooding. I work in the Honors College. I am the director of the Honors Living Learning Community, which are the students living in Honors Hall and Lincoln Hall, working on co-curricular sorts of activities for them, community building, network building, and so on and so forth. I also teach honors courses, and as an American historian, they are all American history classes. My specialty particularly is history of the American family and childhood. I think that'll probably do it. And yes, I agree with Matt. I don't know that expert would be the best term to describe me either. So.
And I think it is a good question to say, why are we here? I mean, I have that question. And it really is, Dr. Marla Gladstone is probably the connecting individual between all of us. She graduated last spring, and I remember meeting Marla a couple of years ago. I never had her in class, but met her through some other students in our department, and she would stop by my office every once in a while and talk, and we would also participate in some similar activities, and I would attend activities that she was organizing. And she asked me last spring if I would participate, and I said no, and she asked me again, and I said no again, and she asked me again, and I said no. And it wasn't because I was afraid of work, but I wanted other voices to be heard. And she said no, talking to other individuals, including Kevin, that she wanted an opportunity to hear these voices to complement what else was taking place. And that leads to our first question that we were going to talk about is like, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you? And to a certain extent, why is it important for leaders to be active, to take an active role, to be proactive in issues like this? Now, when we look at diversity and inclusion, I think, and right now, those words are hot button words for many people. Even in our state, uh, some individuals down in Charleston get very upset with words such as diversity. And I'm not quite sure why. I understand why, to a certain extent, they might not be happy, but with the word itself and with some of the meetings, because I see diversity as recognizing all the differences that exist. And a lot of the differences that sometimes people get mad about, or they get mad about that are not included, I think are included. So if we're talking about religious views or political views, I think all of that falls under diversity. And I do believe that college is an important place where voices should be heard. There was an article in the Chronicle, I believe it was today, that talked about the role of diversity and can diversity still exist on campus? And I think we see it at times when we go in the mountain lair or outside the mountain lair as well. But I'm thinking in particularly inside the mountain lair the last few days. We hear some voices that might be unpopular and unpleasant for some, but viewpoints being expressed in an appropriate, and appropriate is not the right word, but in a non-threatening manner. I think that is a better way of saying it, where an individual is expressing that. So I believe that diversity is being open to many different ideas, many different people, different backgrounds, but inclusion means also involving these individuals, inviting them, involving. Well, we'll talk more about that as well. And I'll turn over to Kevin for a minute. I'll be quiet.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and again, the reason I'm here is Marla, Dr. Gladstone was our GA in honors for a couple years. And so she and I worked together on a variety of things, and she was aware of some of the work I did in the Honors College, one of which is work with our LGBTQ plus and allies affinity group, and some of the other work in community and so on I was familiar with, that she was familiar with I was doing. Diversity and inclusion. For me, diversity as I think about it, want to experience it. The words or the adjectives, richer, vibrant, words like interesting. I see the diversity of peoples as bringing that into an existence where I want to be. With all the variety of as Matt says, of viewpoints, of experiences, of cultures, of beliefs, and so on, contributing to a fascinating, interesting, vibrant society, possibly. I'm one of the people that don't care much for the term inclusion, but not for the reasons other folks might. Inclusion involves power dynamics, because who gets to decide what is the space into which people get to be included or invited, right? Somebody has to decide who gets invited, who gets to be included in that space. So I have a few issues with that term as well, but it's a term we have as well to work with. In terms of kind of slipping into then why it's important for leaders to be active, I guess I would have a question about this. Maybe toss this your direction, Matt. would we be talking all leaders or leaders who would already be sympathetic to such initiatives or already believe in such initiatives? Because that might kind of tailor my answer, temper my answer to that.
I think you could select for yourself.
Okay.
Um, I do think, though, that that does change how one would answer it.
Mhm.
Because if we're talking about a reluctant leader,
Right.
that's a whole different story.
Yeah.
And versus an individual who is interested, but we could still have an individual who is interested, but maybe inexperienced and or ignorant. You know,
Yeah.
and ignorant just meaning unaware, not
Right.
knowing.
Right.
And I see Peter's joined
Yeah.
us. Great.
Yes, I have. I
Hi, Peter.
appreciate that. I was dealing with the fabulous technology. I got caught in Zoom Wonderland.
All right. Well, why don't we go ahead, and Peter, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself before we continue?
Absolutely. My name is Dr. Peter McGahey, and I'm a teaching assistant professor in the College of Applied Human Sciences, and I teach sport coaching. That's where I spend my time. I look after our master's program, and I teach one of our undergraduate classes, and then I do my coach development work in soccer. So my connection to sort of the topic is very similar to others, as a Dr. Marla Gladstone now as well. And again, I spend time working in sort of some of these spaces where the topic that we're discussing tonight comes up, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to join you all.
All right. So Kevin, did you want to revisit that? Defining your own type of leader?
Yeah. I would say that why it would be important for, as you know, the question version that I received, is leaders to be proactive in such efforts, would be in being proactive. I would think you're working to build it into the culture of whatever team you are leading, whatever organization you're leading, instead of responding to a situation or something like that. We saw a lot of the response involvement, within the last 4 years. And some of that lasted and some of that did not. We're very well aware of that fact. But if it's built into the culture of your organization, right? If it's just part of what you are, what you do, and who you are as an organization, then when situations come up, it's just diversity, inclusion, and initiatives, efforts are just part of what you do, right? I don't know if that quite makes sense or not, but that's kind of the way I think about that.
Yeah. Peter, we were looking at that first question about what does diversity and inclusion mean to you, and then why is it important for leaders to be proactive in their approach to this?
I think the place for me is where I've been, again, just running on the racetrack and catching up now, is like the idea about diversity and inclusion is being welcoming and open to everyone, to recognizing and celebrating people for who they are. And I think it's a place where, for me, in my neck of the woods, in terms of coaching, you can see the idea about diversity and the need for diversity and inclusion in lots of areas. You can have it, whether it be in terms of coaching, in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of sexuality, in terms of lots of pieces. You also, in the playing environment, I spend quite a bit of time coaching in what we would call in the para pathway, creating opportunities for athletes with varying and different types of disabilities and making sure that they're included in the playing space. I think it's a place where it's important for leaders to be proactive, because I think what would happen before the proactivity. I think it's a place where, in order for a leader to be proactive, they have to recognize that there's a need, that they have to recognize that there is a space where other individuals need to be welcomed into, that may not have may not have the ability to be included into that space. So the idea of like the real piece for a leader for me that's proactively inclusive and proactively celebrates and proactively welcomes diversity is a leader who has acknowledged that there's a need and not necessarily, I hate to use the word problem, but has acknowledged that there's something that needs to be created for others. So I think that's the place of where the leader really becomes then proactive. It's what happens with their reflection and their process before their, what I would say is proactive behavior.
Good. Second question that we were going to talk about some is over the years, how have we learned to contend with our own personal privilege? And how has our positionality pushed us or allowed us to make changes in places that we can reach? And, you know, reading this question and thinking about it, I don't have an easy answer. I do know that I have grown considerably and that I still have much more to grow. I do know that my exposure to many individuals, maybe even some individuals here today, have helped me grow and become more aware of my privilege. You know, when I was chair, I definitely had a little bit more legitimate power in the organization as far as being able to offer opportunities. I created a course in the early 2000s called American Diversity in Film, and I still teach it, where we focus on different cultures and how they're portrayed in the media, the film. And at first, people thought I, the teacher, would lecture on what they should think about these cultures or how it's wrong or how the films are wrong. But it really was exposing them to readings and then films and then having them on their own talk about what did the reading say? How does it compare to the film? Do you see these stereotypes? And then individuals chose on their own one to explore more deeply. And I'll use the word amazing. It really has been amazing when students write the evals that they have not watched these films critically about how various cultures are portrayed, for good or for bad, and how they see some things over and over again. So, kind of blended in later on, I see this as a small change taking place, like in the classroom, as far as exposing students to something that they wouldn't see differently. Possibly, Kevin, Peter, you looked at this question a little bit differently. Peter, do you want to offer your thoughts on it?
It's a question that absolutely gives you pause, Matt, right? Like, again, how have you recognized your own privilege? I guess I would just share is that without a doubt, I think it's a place where I've been, I would have to acknowledge that I've been there's been places where my privilege has benefited me in terms of the rooms I've been in, the opportunities that I've had, the interviews that I've gotten, jobs that I've had. My hope would be is that it wouldn't be alone my privilege of why I've been able to have the opportunities that I've had, but I think that you could not acknowledge, I wouldn't acknowledge that as a soccer coach that some of the opportunities were afforded to me because of privilege. I think that that's a humbling statement that I think you have to acknowledge. I think it's a place like how have I recognized and brought it into my own sphere, into my own world. I think it's a place of like, you use the term opportunity. That's where I would share is that I've in my over my course of my career, I was a good fortune that prior to moving into faculty full time, I was a women's college soccer coach. So I was in an environment of where that diversity and inclusion is important in terms of Title IX, in terms of what's available to the student athletes and how you recognize that. And as you sort of get wiser in your career, that you become to recognize that in some cases, you have to advocate for your team. But that's the privilege and the responsibility that goes that goes with the position. I would share, as I've sort of continued to grow, and some of it is about, are you recognizing that privilege comes, and now how are you creating opportunities for others that do not have it? Are you committed to hiring a diverse coaching staff? Are you committed to now recruiting women of various backgrounds to your teams? That's in the college setting. Are you now committed to now offering opportunities to people who don't have it? Again, as I mentioned before, I've done some coaching. I do some coaching in the para pathway for athletes with disability. And are you committed to creating authentic, real experiences for those athletes? That's the place where I find my place about trying to live out the diversity and inclusion on a regular basis, is creating opportunities for others that may not have it. That's how I guess I'm trying to live my privilege, I guess would be a way to say that.
And Kevin, what are your thoughts on this question?
Okay, I kind of took this one and focused on, as you all have, the personal growth and so on, the changes and so on in terms of my own behavior, and the internal, doing the work on myself first. And then the next question more about what am I doing beyond myself, as it were. But there's kind of porous boundaries there. As I thought about this one, I kind of actually came down on the phrase, making changes in the place you can reach, places you can reach. And, for me, what came first was, what's the closest place that I can reach is inside myself, right? To acknowledge and understand, who I am, where I come from, where my socioeconomic status is, how that affects my perception of the world, how I can move in the world, those three, consonants after the end of my name there, how that, lends me perhaps an unearned authority in context beyond what I actually know, those sort of things. And try to, understand and just be humble about, how I then move among people, move in the world. I'm thinking one story particularly is, for several years, I've been leading a monthly book study in the local NAACP chapter. And we read, readings on race and rights, and they tend to be historical books. And, we sit down once a month and, start to discuss the reading for the time. And the first thing they want to hear is, okay, it was a history book. What's the historian want to have to say about it? Right. Whether or not it's at my particular area of expertise or not. And I guess I understand that. But so I might say a few things, but, then I get real quiet, because I want to listen, because, we're reading The Rebellious Life of Rosa Parks, and we've got somebody there on the Zoom who grew up in Birmingham in the 50s and 60s. I want to hear your story. Not me, who, was born in Central Ohio in 1964, right? But I want to hear what you have to say, your experience, right? That illuminates, what we're reading, makes real what we're reading here and discussing in the group. I want to hear that. I want to hear my own voice. Okay. I want to hear you. You have way more authority on this than I do, because you lived it. I just read about it or studied it, right? I want to know those sort of things as well. So, the commitment to shutting up and listening to folks, hear what they have to say. So that's kind of where the approach I took on this particular question.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the whole shutting up and listening. And that is something I continue to work on, but I am much better now than I used to be. For a long time, I think I am a good problem solver, but at times I would hear people talk and I would try to solve the problem instead of listening more and letting the person talk and explore possibilities and be there, but not solve the problem. Now, some of the individuals here watching might disagree. They might say, no, you still interfere, but it's something ongoing. to learn that is possibly what my role is, to listen more and to learn and to grow. Another question that we were going to look at was, how have you or we advocated for change in the roles we've had, either now or in the past? Is there something, a success or a challenge or a struggle that we are willing to share? And did either of you have something right off the top of your head you wanted to add first?
Well, I guess I kind of would here. Yeah, going back to, I approach this as, as all three of us are educators, right? And so that is my primary field of work. That is in the classroom, interacting with my students. And that's the one place I have, frankly, the most power to say, here's what's going to be taught. Here's what the expectations that I have of what you are going to learn, right? It's asymmetrical there. So I get to choose what I'm going to include in the syllabus, what we're going to read, what we're going to study. So how do I use that, right? So I've been teaching a class called Growing Up in America since 2011. I had to look back and see when I started because I didn't exactly remember that one. And from the initial, when I designed that initially, I wanted it to be more than a study. Students would learn more than just, okay, here's the ideal stereotypical middle class childhood, right? Because that is a small portion of American childhoods. So I want, the students to understand that, the struggles, the challenges, the successes of indigenous children, right? Of enslaved children, of working children, working in a canning factory in Baltimore where, their little boys are standing there by the belt where the cans are going by and they've got no gloves on, no any sort of protective gear, and how that was affecting them. I wanted them to see, and wherever possible in what they're reading, to hear the voices of these children, to understand all these different experiences as much as possible. And I remember one student in particular who sent me an email several years ago. She said, Dr. Gooding, when when I took that class, I didn't understand why we were learning about all these other kids, right? The ones I've just named. She said, but finally I get it. Because you wanted us to understand that not everybody grew up the way she said I did, or I did for that matter as well. And so, that made me really happy that what I was trying to do actually worked as well.
Peter, does something come to mind?
I wish I had as a powerful story as that, but I think it's a place where I'll lean into the space about what do we create in our classrooms with our students. The idea about teaching them to think critically, to look beyond their own perspective. I changed the culture of I teach one undergraduate class, again, sort of what it would call a general education, a general introduction to coaching. And I changed the course cultures about a little bit more than a year ago. I just wanted the students to feel more welcome. I just wanted them to feel more supported in the learning environment that we were creating. So I instituted something called the Code of the Neighbor. The idea about building a neighborhood, taking a longer term view, valuing people for who they are, and this idea of acknowledging that needs are just needs. They're not necessarily special. And if people can advocate and step into their spaces for themselves and say, hey, I need an extension, I need a help, I need support, I need those things. I've really tried to lean into that culture, recognizing that some first-time students, in terms of the diversity of the students that I'm teaching, may not have all the understandings of the privilege about how college works. And I really have found that that has been incredibly impactful in the culture of the class that I have been creating, and just sharing that the best version of them equals the best version of us. And we want them to show up and be who they are from their perspective. I think the other piece is that within the idea, when you start to talk about what backgrounds and perspectives are, is coaching tends to be taught, as coaches get into it, through a very myopic view about the way I was coached, that was the way it was supposed to, right? And it's a place about where we have these real judgments about all different cultures and how things look. And I'll just share a story that changed my perspective, the idea about leaning in and listening. We were showing this idea about, again, it's not acceptable, it's dangerous, it's all these things about sort of the stress that parents are under at youth sporting environments, and those things, and sort of sometimes the inappropriate violence that ensues. And I was showing a video for the class, and I was asking them to think about it and their view and those things. And I'll never forget, I can tell you right where the young lady was sitting and the perspective was. And she raised her hand and she said, Dr. McGahey, I certainly appreciate that perspective. However, in my town, in my community, if you didn't engage in it that way, it would have been worse for you than if you did. That was my culture in my community. And that was something that changed my perspective of, wait a second, there's a place of where my perspective needs to be broadened to say that this behavior is not appropriate. However, in some communities and some cultures, those things are going to be places where we're still growing and learning. And that really influenced me in terms of how I've thought about it, how I've talked about it, and how I've encouraged those diversities of perspective in my classes.
That sounds great. I think we all realize as teachers or as students that the teacher does not go into the classroom and tell the student, this is what you should think, and the student automatically thinks that. No matter what other people in the world think, it doesn't work that way. But one thing that we can do for students, and I think we all do to a certain extent, is we expose them to information, we expose them to opportunities. Many years ago, probably 20 years ago, I was teaching a class in public communication to 200 students. And a couple times a week, we'd watch a 3 to 5 minute person giving a speech, usually a famous individual, but a person given a 3 to 5 minute speech, and it related to the topic we talked about that day. And I remember near the end of the semester, a student came up to me and said, I've noticed that all the speakers this semester, none of them have been white males. And I just looked at them and I go, what do you mean? And they go, we haven't had any famous white males speak. And I go, I haven't noticed that. I just kind of like brush it aside. But it's a subtle way that I tried to expose individuals to people and voices they might not have heard otherwise. When I think of some recent interactions in the classroom, possibly 3 different times, 3 different classes, a student has made a comment about pronouns. Like one student makes a negative comment about pronouns. And instead of coming down hard or correcting or saying some statement, where we talk about it, we talk about why. And I use an example that, like many of us would, that if someone's name was William and they say they want to be called Bill, or if they want to call Bucky, we call them Bucky. And to call someone a name that they don't want to be called is kind of being a bully. And to a certain extent, it's the same way with pronouns. And it doesn't have to change what you think. It's just a matter of a low level respect for a given person. And I don't know, it changes the behavior. In persuasion, we talk about how it's easier to change behavior than attitudes. It does change the behavior. But does it change what they think? Well, I think it gives them something to think about, and then we go from there. I do think teachers have a responsibility, leaders have a responsibility, but teachers have a responsibility to have an environment that is safe, where individuals can express ideas, but at the same time, when they express thoughts, it can't be hurtful or too aggressive, individuals. When I circulated some questions, I kind of brought out the issue of, is there someone or something we would like to highlight involving WVU or an alum? And for those of you watching, In the chat, I posted some information about two of the alums from the comm department who recently have authored books. Sean Anderson got his doctorate, and he wrote a book about the Black Athlete Revolt. It just came out about a year and a half ago, and there's a link to his professional page. Sean works with professional teams. Currently, he's working with the LA Rams. He did his doctorate. I was his advisor. He did his doctorate looking at diversity issues with the Major League Baseball teams, and he got permission from the national office to contact the teams. 2/3 of them cooperated with him fully, which was wonderful. He also works with PBS with some of their issues dealing with diversity, and I invite you to check him out. I also have a link there to Ife EK. She got her bachelor's and her master's from our department. She went on and got a law degree. She wrote a book called The Equity Mindset, Designing Human Spaces Through Journeys, Reflections, and Practices. I cannot recommend this book more. It is a bargain. It is not expensive. It is a how-to book. It talks about diversity issues. It is a slap in the face for many of us to read. I'm a big fan of her. She was an outstanding alum in our college, but on her website, blog, in the book, she talks about doing your own work and some of the steps that you have to do. And there's numerous times she writes things where I'm uncomfortable. And I think that's a good thing. Finally, I put a link to a daily listserv I'm on. I guess it's a listserv called Anti-Racism Daily. And this person posts essays every day on a given topic, links. They have guest authors dealing with a lot of different diversity issues. Gives me a lot to think about. And I have to admit, I don't always agree 100% with all the thoughts being expressed, but it gives me things to think about. And I think that's part of the, as we were talking about before, the listening part, the not talking, not arguing, listening, and I read and I think, and then possibly later on there might be some engagement. But definitely check out those links. I strongly encourage you to. Kevin, was there anything that you wanted to share or add?
Yeah, I just want to kind of to give a shout out, particularly to some of the folks who probably been some of my best teachers the past few years. And that's the members of our LGBTQ plus affinity group. They have shown me a lot of joy in being together. Just having a location or the opportunity for them to come together, and they just love that so much. They've been very gracious to me when I have messed up in language and so on. I will tell you one very embarrassing story. Okay, that happened beginning of last year. We had our first meeting of the year of the group and had new folks in there as well. And I have this very silly icebreaker. I hate icebreakers, but I have one that I'm comfortable with. Okay. And it's, I will pick, you do the standard stuff, name, rank, serial number, name, where you're from, what you're majoring in. And then I pick, if you were a so-and-so, tell us what you would be, a cheese, right? A dessert. Not thinking, just going for that group. I said, okay, so name, where you're from, what you're majoring in, and if you were a fruit, what would you be? They lost it, hysterically laughing, and I was horrified because I was, oh, give me those words back, right? No, 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 no. And they laughed, and when they stopped laughing, they said, no, Dr. Gooding, that was perfect. Thank you. And so they've just extended so much grace to me and have taught me so much. And I hope that in return, I have helped them as well. So I want to give them a shout. They're fantastic.
Great. Peter, is there something that comes to your mind here?
I will not. I will not. I will defer and leave the quality stories and the stage where it has been set.
All right. I do think, as you were talking, Kevin, it did make me think of the issues of like forgiveness and compassion. Um, that individuals are going to make errors, they're going to make mistakes, they're going to use the wrong pronouns, they're going to use a phrase. Uh, Over the last 5-10 years, I've become much more aware of phrases that had other meanings to people that I did not know. And I'm not even going to give any examples, but I think we could think of some phrases that, everyone used, but we didn't know that the meaning came from, some negative connotation. And it just became part of our language. And if an individual does say something inappropriately, and if that individual works towards making amends, and whether that's ourselves or others, I think that whole issue of um, allowing a second and third chance for what's going on. Early on, we talked about the leaders that might not be supportive of some of the things we've been talking about. And um, I sometimes have a difficult time when anyone gives a leader or a person too much grief about something they did 20 or 30 years ago, whether it's our current president or a former president. And if someone says they did this or said this 20 years ago, and then they say, I was wrong, this is why I was wrong, and I've been working on making a difference or change, I think not that we erase it, but that we try to work with that person. And I say that as maybe being one of those individuals. Maybe if someone says, well, I remember this. Well, if there was a this, let's work on resolving that and let's see what we can do. Which kind of leads us to our last question. And I do invite, right now, I haven't seen anyone offer a question, but if someone has a question, please forward it and we'll try to answer it. But one of the last questions that we had for ourselves was, in 2024, what challenges does WVU face when we talk about diversity and inclusion? And what can we do? Someone alluded to this earlier, and they didn't say we've taken steps back, but if there was any momentum a few years ago, I don't think that momentum is there. And I think that there's also more of a reluctance to even talk about some of the issues under this umbrella. I know that's just an initial thought. Kevin or Peter, what are your thoughts on that?
This is where you have two veteran professors in the wait time contest.
Real comfortable
I
with
can wait
silence.
forever.
I
can
appreciate
wait
it.
to
I
spare.
appreciate that. Thinking time. Two people with veteran educators waiting on thinking time. No, I guess I would just share, Matt. I think it's a place of where I guess in sort of trying to make sure the idea about trying to change the world that you can influence. It's some of it is I try not to, again, some of this maybe is the coaching background, is try to always look at sort of where my feet are at and what I can influence. I just think it's a place that we have to recognize, again, if you talk about particularly in the field of sport in general, I think it's a place that we have to be leaning into these topics. We have to be willing to share these topics. You acknowledge some of the conversations about people in positions of authority who don't like terms and words and those things. I think we have to be willing to say more in our space of sport, because the reality is diversity and inclusion, we're in it every day in the sporting environment. And I think we have to be willing to sort of step in and just say, talk to people and address the issues and not get lost in terms and terminology and avoidance and pretend if somehow we call it this, it's not really this. I just try to step into the space of like, if it's like, we shouldn't have to change diversity in sport. because that would make somebody uncomfortable. Like, and I can appreciate uncomfortableness and I want to be respectful of those things, but I think it's a place where if we're going to step into these hard conversations and we're going to have them, I think we have to be willing to have them in the spaces that we can. And that's just a place where I know that I'm in my small little world and sphere. That's the places where I'm trying to influence as best I can.
Well, my sarcastic, semi-sarcastic one-word answer to the question is the legislature. But from some of the bills that have come down the past couple of years, particularly divisive concept bills, right? I've watched those very carefully because they deal with my content, right? This is what I teach, and I've described what I teach. And initially I was, I guess, pretty scared, honestly. Um, you know, is this going to interfere with what I teach and how I teach it? And I guess I got to the point where it's like, nah, this, what I know what I teach is backed up by the research. I know it's sound. I know it, that there are subject matter that my students have told me they enjoy, as I've told, learning about things they haven't seen, voices they haven't heard. I'm going to keep doing that, right? Because that's, I think that's right. And that's the way I approach what I do and what I teach. So.
Yeah, the first part of your answer made me very sad because it just made me think of, the struggles in our state. And at times it does feel hopeless is a strong word, but it's discouraging. It's discouraging to hear some voices, but it's also important for me personally to hear the voices and to try to work, to try to see how what I'm trying to accomplish personally, but also when we're talking about topics that like we are today, how they can still work. And I do believe I teach this in my classes on argumentation and other courses that the values that many individuals have are very, very similar. And we tend to focus on the differences and that maybe focusing on some of those similarities at times. I did forget to put something in the chat that I intended to this morning in e-news. I saw that there was going to be some type of short film festival where there was going to be short films. It's going to be in a Gluck Theater one day, health sciences another day. About I can't even remember the topic right now, but it was like short 5-minute videos that they'd be showing. I don't know if either of you saw that. I'll look at it here real quick as I'm talking. But I try to share with my students frequently what's happening on campus, different speakers, different events. And they get probably a little tired of me sharing that news, but a lot of times they'll say they do not hear from it otherwise. All right. Just give me a moment. It's not too far away. Oh, you'll just have to trust me that it was not e-news today. I think it was in the e-news yesterday. Or am I no, excuse me, I am looking in Mondays. I need to look at today's. So let me get the e-news. All right. So there's going to be, it says a film screening to celebrate individuals with disabilities. And it is taking place on March 5th and March 6th. And it is a series of 5-minute films that are going to be rotated. Individuals can enter and leave at any given time. So this is the first I've heard of this. It was on e-news earlier today. Might be the only time I hear about it. And my students might not hear about it, but I mean, they're going to hear about it for me because I'm going to talk about it in class for 30 seconds and just leave it there. something to possibly check out. And I think the more opportunities that we can do that personally, the more opportunities that our campus can do that. And the more times they see us attending and participating in events like that, that's something minor, little that we can do. So I'd like to thank, unless anyone has anything to add, I was going to say I'd like to thank my fellow panelists for being here today. I don't see any questions. I appreciate the sharing of information, and I appreciate Marla for all the work that she did over her years at WVU, but also bringing us together to talk about this. And you might disagree with me, but if anyone would like to reach out to us with a question personally, feel free to do so. Savannah, is that all right?
Yep, that's fine. If you have questions and you want to put them in the Q&A, you can. If not, believe Dr. Martin's email is matt.martin@mail.wvu.edu. So go to him with any questions you may have. We really appreciate your time this evening, and the opportunity to visit with you. Like an archived version of this webinar will be available later on the Honors College website. So thank you for spending your evening with us. Thank you, panelists. Your insight was really, really appreciated, not only by me, but I'm sure by everyone else. And with that, I think we're good. So have a good evening, everyone.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
again, Kevin.
Thank you.